Good morning. Welcome to the Point. Well, it's 2018, and if you were with us for our first show of the year last week, you know much of our conversation is going to be about the big election. There's a U.S. Senate seat up for a vote, as well as governor and lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, all of our congressional delegation, as well as all of the seats in the state house and state senate. It is a big election here in Michigan, but there will be factors outside of the state that could impact that election, such as the Trump factor. We went to GVSU and their political science department to talk with one of their members about this important election. Here's our conversation with Erica King. Let's begin with the Trump effect. We know from 2016, from the night of the election, the entire political landscape changed, and it created the resist movement and any number of other movements. And going into this very important election cycle here in Michigan, even though the president is not on the ballot, the Trump effect will still be in play, won't it?
Absolutely, and this is not unique to Trump. The Trump effect is unique to Trump, but the fact that a recently elected president is, quote unquote, an invisible but very much present entity for a midterm election, especially the first midterm election.
And those midterm elections do not always bode well for the party that is in power. For example, the Republicans, who won the House, the Senate, and the White House, have a lot to defend going into 2018, even though if in Michigan only a couple of those congressional seats look like they may be competitive, you never know what's going to happen if it becomes a wave election.
You never know, and you've used the right term, a wave election, because you get several things happening in a midterm election. And one is, I think, that you get different people tending to turn out to vote. Now, what's interesting about 2018 is that it may differ from the general pattern. Usually what happens is that the party in power doesn't have as much enthusiasm, as much excitement, let's be brutally frank, as much anger as the party that's already holding the power. And the party that's holding power has an opportunity, even for people that voted for its candidates, to get kind of irritated if they don't think that the candidates now in office or the party are delivering for them. So there's just more opportunity for people to vote against something than for something. Now, with 2018, my question is going to be, will the Trump effect really sort of cause a reaction on steroids, that because he has elicited such strong emotions, and yes, of course, some of those emotions are very favorable and very positive, but especially for Democrats, and as we're also discovering, even for a lot of people who would call themselves independent moderates, there is a significant amount of frustration and irritability, to put it mildly. Will that bring more people to the polls? Will the Republicans have a problem with greater apathy? This is going to be interesting to observe. We just saw in the state of Alabama, a solidly Republican, a red state, a very interesting phenomenon where, in fact, the unexpected happened, and that is a Democrat won a statewide race. So there you go. So this is something that Republicans have to worry about. At the same time, however, I think Democrats can't sit back on their laurels, because part of the problem for Democrats is in off-year elections, their turnout often sinks quite dramatically.
So let's talk a little bit about that turnout, because as you point out, Democrats, particularly in Michigan, have a track record of not turning out. But for that turnout, there have been some pretty close elections that they might have well been able to prevail. So you have a combination of, you mentioned earlier, anger. You have people who are disappointed, perhaps, and you have this big slate of candidates, 148 members of the state Senate and House, and governor and lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, U.S. Senate race, all the congressional seats. How did Democrats turn that unhappiness with the 2016 election into a 2018 victory, if they can?
Well, that also is an interesting question because you have, as you say, so many different people on the ballot, so many different levels of office. And what we're also discovering, and I know you are very up on this, is the Democratic Party totally unified? Are they walking in lockstep with specific ideas about what they want to accomplish? The answer is the Democrats are also in a bit of disarray. I think that, interestingly, the Trump effect for Democrats has been, for Democrats who are activists and Democratic Party leaders, has been to energize them. But that doesn't mean that they're in lockstep with a single message. So if you're a party and candidates running with a variety of different messages, some of which are a tad in conflict with each other, that can be an issue for a party achieving success also. So what I think, if I were a Republican strategist, I would be very much in this day and age saying to my candidates, think about yourself and what you want to stand for and what you want to represent as a Republican, and contemplate less perhaps the Trump effect, but think of the old adage for Michigan, all politics is local. But I'd also be saying that to Democrats as well. And I think, for example, local Democrats, there are different desires and needs and different kinds of constituents in different parts of the state. The Detroit area and the Grand Rapids area focus more on the local issues. I think the trick for the candidates on both sides of the aisle who are running for a statewide election is trying to figure out what can bring disparate parts of the state together.
One of the things that you and I as observers, and Republicans and Democrats as parties, would be remiss in not factoring into this election is another effect, and that is the Bernie effect. Because, as you point out, Democrats are not unified and walking in lockstep. And if you need any further evidence than that, one of the candidates that most people have never heard of until this election cycle has already purchased $1 million in advertising that will include the Super Bowl, and the tagline is the most progressive candidate for governor. And so that really does suggest that there is still this battle within the Democratic Party about who they want to be and how far to the progressive side they want to go versus maybe a considered more mainstream candidate. And that could be a bit of a struggle as we move through the primary season.
Absolutely a struggle. And again, one of the key constituencies here that I think both parties are trying to reach toward are the people in the middle, the moderates, who are not closely psychologically affiliated with either party. And the more the Democratic candidates represent themselves as quote unquote true progressives, the more they risk alienating the people in the middle.
As is the case for the more a candidate associates himself, if you're a Republican and you identify yourself as a Trump Republican, people in the middle can be alienated by that too.
One of the fascinating things I'm going to be looking at as well is how Trump, over the next 8 months or so, allies himself with the quote-unquote Republican establishment. Because to this point, he's been playing an interesting game of partly trying very much to appeal to his base, but also courting the Republican establishment. I have a horrible track record in predicting anything, but that doesn't deter me. I think what we may see with Trump is more of a move toward the establishment and presenting himself and his issues more in an establishment mode.
That's an interesting prediction. However, you have some relatively recent history that would back up such a supposition, because you don't get a tax plan passed without being able to go to the heart of the Republican Party and the establishment Republicans, even some that he's had Twitter wars with, who end up supporting him on a tax plan that I thought looked very improbable. So there is already some history of him doing that.
Yeah. And one of the things, as a very clever businessman, and a strong track record is I think the president is somewhat pragmatic. And what seems to be working well for him, and you're absolutely right, the legislative success. And right now, talking about bipartisanship, working with the Democrats, we don't know how that will work out, but at least he's presenting himself as a model of this.
We will not say how long you and I have been doing this, but it's been a while. And we've got some decades of collective experience that we can look at. And I find that people are just shy of hysterical about the current political situation in some cases.
Yes.
And my question is, again, as not just an educator, but as an observer, do we get a little too excited about things? Because while Donald Trump is clearly a unique presidential figure, we have had political chasms in this country for a very long time.
Try the Civil War.
Well, exactly. And that makes everything else pale in comparison, obviously. But even more recently, if you think about the Vietnam War and the great divide that created, or the Watergate scandal and the great angst that caused, or any number of other things that you can tick off. I don't mean to equate them, except to say that having political upheaval is just part of who we are.
And it's one of the things that our very wise founding fathers took into account when they designed a constitutional system that allows for checks and balances, federalism, so both some degree of local control and some degree of national control. Absolutely. I think it's very easy to live in the moment and get extremely worried about things, which is not to say that I don't think we're facing some incredible problems, especially on the international level, where we have less control because we're one of a number of international players. So perhaps being very worried about that. But I think in terms of domestic politics, if you actually look at the moment at Trump's biggest legislative accomplishment, it is absolutely something that establishment Republicans, the leaders of Congress and the other members of the Republican Party in Congress, they've been aiming for years. So they also have now a real sense of being able better to work with Trump, that they can work, that I think they see him as somebody who will in fact able them to further their own establishment Republican mainstream goals.
There are a couple of short-term issues that are coming up, but I want to try this suggestion out on you. If, and I put that in capital letters, if by June, Republicans and Democrats came up with a cohesive plan to do real infrastructure reform, and this would come with a really big price tag, which means that Republicans would have to hold their nose and not worry about the furthering of the debt, with the promise, no doubt, being that repatriation of money that they believe will come in offshore because of their tax plan would make up the difference. Not suggesting by any stretch that would actually happen, but I think that's the case that will be made. But if there was a really significant infrastructure program that also promised and was already starting to deliver some real jobs, does that change the calculus going into the election?
I think it would change part of the calculus. I don't think it would change, for example, the calculus on the part of the very progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which, yes, is very much in favor of government expenditures and would be very much in favor of infrastructure, but they're so very concerned about other aspects of social and cultural issues and the whole concept of economic inequality, that I think you're not necessarily going to woo that group of individuals, but I do think other Democrats who would consider themselves, and be considered by people like you and me, more moderates, that is certainly something. And you see in public opinion poll after poll, what the American public likes is the idea of bipartisanship and having government do something rather than squabble all of the time. So that could change the calculus. Again, so many things can intervene, though. That's the whole question, that you can talk about having a perfectly wonderful bipartisan infrastructure problem, and if something hideous happens on the international stage, all bets are off.
Which is why between now and November is an eternity in politics.
Yes.
But you bring up something I want to touch on for a moment. Poll after poll, as you point out, say, we want bipartisanship. We want you to work together. We want you to come up with a solution. And on paper, or on the phone, as these polls are often done, that sounds good. Yet, increasingly, to win your party's nomination, you have to get as far to the fringes as you possibly can, which makes bipartisanship much more difficult. And I present as no better example than 1996, when Bob Dole, who had been the Senate Majority Leader, became the presidential nominee. Republicans ran away from him because he was too much in favor of compromise. He had been somebody who was making deals in the United States Senate. In other words, he was bipartisan, and they dropped him like a hot potato.
Well, you raise some very interesting issues, because there's a whole concept of polarization in this country at the present time. And to what extent is polarization a phenomenon of the public versus a phenomenon of political activists and political elites? And there are a couple of interesting things going on here. One is, we have a system now of primaries that are utilized to choose the party's nominees. And one of the things that's been happening many places, not every place, but in many places across the country at all levels of government, is that if you're a Democrat, you're going to be worried about being primaried from the left. If you're a Republican, you're going to be worried about being primaried from the right. So that tends to push the activists and the candidates farther apart. That's one issue. The other issue, I think, is one you've been studying a lot in Michigan and talking about: gerrymandering of districts, where we have become in this country, both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, extremely competent in dividing up legislative district lines to benefit whichever is the party in power in a particular state.
So politics will dominate much of the conversation in Lansing, in Washington, and right here on our Sunday morning show. But it won't be all politics. There is still some policy. And one piece of policy that will come up very early in this year may be a bit unexpected, and it could have a big impact on your pocketbook. We'll talk about that next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. You no doubt have heard a good deal about the tax plan that Republicans passed in Washington late last year. Republicans say it will give you a tax cut. Democrats say it will only help the rich. No matter which side you're on, there is one thing for sure. The federal tax code and the state tax code in many states, including Michigan, have some linkage. And here in Michigan, at least, the changes in Washington could actually lead to an increase in how much you pay in state taxes. It is a bit confusing, but we tried to explain it this morning with Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley. Mr. Lieutenant Governor, let's talk for a moment about tax reform at the federal level and how that impacts us here at the state. I'll try to describe it as best I can in layman's terms, and you can tell me with a banker's background what it really means. But the idea is that the personal exemption was linked from the state to the federal. That personal exemption went away at the federal level in exchange for a much larger standard deduction, but when it went away at the federal level, it also eliminated the personal deduction at the state. Is that more or less right?
It is. Like a lot of states, our state attaches to the federal tax code for simplicity's sake. So you figure something once at the federal level, and then we use those same numbers on our tax code so that you don't have to recalculate. But in this case, our state tax law says however many exemptions you claim at the federal level, you get to claim that many at the state level. Well, now with this really big standard deduction, you won't have people claiming personal exemptions at the federal level anymore. And that will make a big difference for our taxpayers if we don't make this change. For the average family of four, the personal exemptions make a $680 difference a year in their taxes. So that's why it's really important that we get this exemption restored, and we're also proposing to increase it beyond that over the course of the next few years.
Up to $4,500, if I understand.
That's right. This year, assuming that we get this restored, it'll be $4,000 per person. So a family of four, that's $16,000 of income that is deducted on your state tax bill. But there's a need then for us to make a change in the federal law so that those deductions for our taxpayers and their dependents are still available this year.
When you talk about the optics of it, obviously, you as a Republican, particularly with Republicans taking credit for this tax reform at the federal level, don't want it to be a net loss for people here in the state of Michigan. What, if anything, does this do to the revenue stream for the state by putting this personal deduction back in?
By putting it back in, it reduces the amount of money that would otherwise come to the state. We figure that it's about $1.5 billion in additional revenue that would have come to the state or will come to the state if we don't make this change. So by making this change and then also increasing it, we're erring on the side of making sure that our citizens retain all of the benefits that they receive from the federal tax cut without having any state increase, but then also giving them a little extra on the state level as well.
For this to get done, obviously you can do it with just Republican votes. Do you have any sense if there's any bipartisan support for this?
This component of it, I am hopeful that we'll see broad bipartisan support for. There's a lot of debate over taxes, and that's nothing new. But restoring this exemption is something that I've seen signals, at least from across the political spectrum, a willingness to consider this. So I'm hopeful that that means that it'll move through in an expeditious manner and move through as fast as possible, because even though this is for the taxes that'll be filed next year, withholding is already happening right now, and removing this uncertainty would be a very positive step for Michigan.
If you consider that there may be bipartisan support, you also have to consider that there are some Republicans, particularly in the House, that will say, yes, we want this deduction, and oh, by the way, we started out at the beginning of last year saying we wanted to first eliminate and then reduce the income tax, neither of which were achieved. Does this give some of those tax hawks a platform to bring that up again?
Well, I think that issue has been very active really ever since last year. It never really was settled. So when people put different tax proposals on the table, I expect they'll still go through the normal process that they did before and will be debated and considered. This one, though, I think is more urgent. The restoration of this deduction is something that needs to happen in short order to remove this uncertainty for how much people are withholding, their employers are withholding from the paychecks and so forth. This is an issue that I don't think we can really afford to wait for a longer term debate on.
With the legislature returning to Lansing for their first full week of session next week, expect a bill that would reflect that change coming up very soon. The Lieutenant Governor says he hopes he can get bipartisan support and would like to see it passed quickly. We're back with more To the Point. So this year will be much about politics. For the state of Michigan, it's one of the more significant elections because it has everything on the table. But there will be some policy action too, but expect most of that to happen early in the year. The later we get, it's all politics. We'll talk about it. To the Point.